China has manufactured goods for export and trade for thousands of years, but the history of the British and American trade with China is much more recent. Tea, silks, and spices were the high-priced commodities, but porcelain tableware was shipped in massive quantities to the West in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some of it was custom-made for aristocratic families. Other patterns and designs were created for the general market. The export porcelain produced between 1795 and 1842, the end of the First Opium War, was especially fine and beautifully decorated, and this exhibit showcases hallmark and rare examples from that period, amassed in an important private collection in Dallas. In Imperial China, foreign trade and interactions were carefully controlled. All the porcelain in this exhibit was shipped from the port of Canton, now Guangzhou, which from 1757 to 1842 was the exclusive export hub.
Well, I'm going to start by making this observation. A friend of mine, a very well-known, one of the leading curators in America, at a major museum, said to me once, "You know, Howard, I've spent my life studying art and studying certain aspects of art, but I will never know as much as some of the passionate collectors." And so we thought it would be appropriate to have a visit with the collector, who has very generously lent the works in this fabulous exhibit that we have of Famille Rose. And Reg, my question is this: what got you going? What prompted you to collect Famille Rose, and what is Famille Rose? Where does that name come from?
Well, it's an artificial title that was added later in the 19th century to group various colors of porcelain into families. So Famille Rose meaning the pink family. It was introduced into China during the reign of Yang Cheng, about 1720, by the Jesuits, who were missionaries in the court at Beijing, who brought the techniques from Europe and the pigments, which the Chinese began to use. Prior to that, during the reign of Kangxi, the porcelains that were colored, other than the blue and white, were Famille Verte, or the green colors. They were transparent and watercolor-like. With the introduction of Famille Rose, there was a pigment that was an opaque white, that was a lead arsenate, which they were able to mix and do shading of color, which gave depth. And this pink color was something new to the Chinese. It was thought to be a chloride of gold, which created this pink color. And so by using that and mixing it with the white, there were many shades available. And these were called, the Chinese referred to them as soft colors, or foreign colors, because they'd been brought in by the foreigners and were made largely for the foreign market. By the end of the reign of Qianlong later, these wares had replaced the popularity of all the other things. And so not only for the court, but for export, largely Famille Rose porcelains were being produced. The high point is always thought to be the reign of Yang Cheng, so that ends about 1740. And the pieces were very beautiful and very sophisticated, highly mannerist, very attenuated figures, very formally produced, and the quality of the porcelain body itself was particularly high. During the reign of Qianlong, because the trade became so important, the quality of wares began to sort of deteriorate toward the end of the century. By the end of the century, the East India Company ceased trading in China altogether, and so the only, this was a great blow to the economy in Canton, and a number of the enamelers undoubtedly went out of business, so that only the very best survived. And so there was a revival of sort that's been widely overlooked, about 1795, that extended to the time of about the First Opium Wars in 1839. And these are the wares that are presented here.
That's what.
The porcelain trade never amounted to more than 10% at the most of the value of what the East India Company was bringing back. So there began to be a panic in England about what to do because all the money was flowing out. So they began to process opium upriver from Calcutta, which was their port where they traded with
India.
Canton. In Patna, they began to farm opium, process it, and sell it to the Chinese, which was not a problem originally. But since it was addictive and everyone used it, there was a great imbalance in the other direction. And so poor Dao, the emperor, the Daoguang emperor, inherited this terrible problem from his predecessor, the Daqing emperor.
Let me ask you this question. Do you think the problem, as he perceived it, was more addiction or economics?
It was economics.
Economics. So he didn't care that much about
He was a
addiction.
user too, I think.
Oh, he was?
Yeah, I think so. I think he was an addict as well. But they began to panic because it was not the way they understood things. The Chinese were never selling their goods. They were always accepting tribute to their almighty emperor, who was the son of heaven. They didn't lower themselves to deal in commerce. So the traders would bring things in tribute, and the Chinese would gift them in return. It was their way of looking at it. And so eventually they began to realize that it was a real problem, and Daoguang Emperor sent his emissary to the south to more or less, they sort of had their version of the Boston Tea Party. They boarded the boats, took the opium away, and destroyed it.
But was the opium coming strictly from the British, or were the Americans involved in that as well?
They were involved in it, but only they were not producing it.
So the British had
Everybody was making
a
money.
monopoly on the opium, which is produced in India, shipped to China to trade or create.
They mixed it with some material, and they made things that looked sort of like bowling balls. Well, we would say bowling balls. These balls of opium, and they were taken into the harbor, unloaded on little ships, and if it was illegal, then the Chinese were certainly complicit in it as well. Everyone was willing to take the money and pass it along. So when it became illegal to bring it in, the British simply used that as they were very clever about it. After the destroying of the opium, they demanded that they be repaid. And eventually they wound up with Hong Kong. And this really set the tone for all of the problems that we have with dealing with China today. Their perception of having been taken advantage of by the West is very prominent today. The distrust between the two sides. Well, I have been interested in furniture, English furniture particularly. And furniture of the 18th century, there was a great interest in chinoiserie, the East, our idea of what the Orient was like, which of course is now a politically incorrect term, but our concept of what the exotic East was like. And so there are many fanciful versions of that. When I was young, I bought a chest of furniture, a furniture chest that was decorated with what they call Japanware, and so it has all these fanciful gilded figures on a black background. And I lived with it for many years, and so I think that probably attracted me to that sort of decoration particularly. So there are people with parasols and elephants and all sorts of exotica. And when you visited antiques dealers in those days, the ones who bought porcelain very often bought that sort of material, so it was there and available to see. It was all lumped together. There was no differentiation, which is part of the sad part of this collecting area. I think most people who bought it simply used it decoratively. The serious collections, like the Percival David, is it the David collection in England, Percival David? The serious collections stopped at 1900, or I'm sorry, at 1800. There simply was no interest in the 19th century. It was all lumped as Victoriana, even though that didn't occur for quite some time after that. But it was all lumped together, indiscriminately labeled as Rose Canton. The English dealers sold it to the Americans because it was not very good, much like the Chinese sold it to whoever the tradesmen were because it was not very good, in their opinion. I think collecting is a series of discoveries. As you get into something, you learn more and more and how to differentiate and learn about what you're collecting. Well, collecting has changed a lot since I began, in that now the internet's become very important.
Yeah.
And so with search engines, things pop up, little thumbnails. If you've collected enough and have seen enough material, you can pretty much tell from a thumbnail if something has merit or is at least worth a second glance. The most important piece that's being shown here is a large lidded urn with a sort of a, almost like a parasol top. It's a Western form. I've never seen anything like it, and I saw a photograph of it on the internet with a search engine. It was coming up for auction in a small town in the north part of Suffolk in England. So I didn't know if it was correct or not, because I'd never seen the form of that period. The decoration looked good, but I knew that with the size of it, it's quite large, that if it were what I thought it would bring a good deal of money. So it's a little iffy to be bidding on something if you haven't laid your hands on it. So we took a plane to Heathrow, rented a car, and drove.
And when you took that plane, what was the time gap between when you saw the image and you?
3 or 4 days.
So that was pretty.
The auction was coming up, and so there wasn't much time to waste. Generally, good pieces don't go unnoticed. There are other people who are just as smart and have more money.
Did you run into any other collectors when you made your venture?
No. The difficulty of buying at auction in England is that the English dealers conspire with each other and do what they call knockouts. They're illegal, but they agree not to go above a certain price, and then they meet out in the parking lot afterwards, and someone takes the goods home, and the others participate in the proceeds. So it's bad for the seller, very good for the buyer, and ultimately bad for the future buyer. In this case, we drove several hours to get there. By the time we'd gotten off the plane, got in the car, and gotten to the far east of England. And we drove up to an unprepossessing building that was the auction house, as they often are, and walked in, and there was a gentleman sweeping the floor, and they were just about to close. And I sort of begged if I could just see this one piece, which was sort of cast aside over in the corner. It was it was in the first 5 lots the next morning, and so there was not much chance. And he allowed me to go look at it, and it was the right thing. I knew immediately that it was a great piece. Funnily enough, because I'd had some bad experience in the past of being noticed in a showroom, a friend of mine suggested that I not attend the auction, but that I bid on the telephone even though I was there. So I went back to the hotel in the next little town, had arranged for the call the next morning, waited nervously after breakfast, and the cell phone rang, and they said, your lot's about to come up, and the call dropped.
Oh, oh Lord!
I was frantic. They were supposed to call the backup number was the downstairs desk. The downstairs desk, whoever answered the phone said they'd never heard of me, and I lost the piece.
Oh no!
So we frantically drove the 9 miles back to the town of Beccles, and begged to find out who had bought the piece. Of course, that was a compromise. They don't really do that sort of thing, but I just said, is it a London dealer? And they confessed that it was, so I knew pretty much who had bought the piece. So I called my friend Polly Latham in Boston, who did business with a fellow in London, and we said, we'll drive into London, pick up the piece and take it home. But he was very coy about it, and he played with us for 6 months before I had to pay a good deal more for it. But as embarrassed and humiliating as it was at the time, and I never felt so foolish to have made all this effort and to lose it over a cell phone call. I did wind up with the piece. Well, we know that there were literary sources, and presumably these came directly from woodblock prints that were probably promulgated and passed around in China. And I'm not really sure why they would have chosen this other than it was just available to copy. The stories are very difficult to understand in the cases where we know what they were, some of them. And then to recognize some of the depictions, as I've said before, you almost have to have a third eye to understand what's going on in some cases. Some were historically used. They go back earlier, some depictions. There are Taoist images, which are particularly arcane to us.
And people may not know what Taoist means, but that was...
Well, one of the early religions of China, before Buddhism, before Confucianism, back to sort of the earliest times with sort of a nature religion.
What kind of images would reference Taoism in your China?
Well, there would often be people depicted, but then there might be a mysterious transformation. Laura and I were discussing a platter upstairs where people are in a churning, or their figures, which are presumably people, are gods in a churning sea, and one's riding a dragon and another is appearing in a shell. We really don't know what that's depicting. But that would have been a Taoist image. It's not really a narrative as far as we know, but there are representations of various gods. And there's an enormous platter that's displayed on the wall with a brown border. And that's a very commonly used image where the 8 immortals cross the sea to visit the Queen Mother of the West. And that's something that's historically been used time and time again and continues to this day in popular culture. Originating in Taoism, but sort of coming over to pop culture now. And probably our video games.
Probably,
yeah. Immortals.
Reference to that.
There are a group of stories about the Yang family, and one of the women became widowed and had to take up arms and go to battle. And a couple of the large vases have that as a reference.
Interesting. We'll have to depict that. We'll find that image.
So there are women on horseback and with swords drawn attacking. The other important sources that are particularly depicted in what's shown here, you'll see many warrior figures, and these are almost certainly from one of the great novels of China, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, in the Warring States period, 200 to 300 AD. And much of it is probably legendary, based in fact, maybe like the Odyssey is legendary but based in fact, as we think and learn more. And so there are many scenes shown there of warriors on horses or carrying banners and flags, and those are recurring themes. I happen to particularly like those. Then another source is a play, The Romance of the Western Chamber, which was a Ming era play, I believe, which was quite a long play and involved forbidden love. A young scholar falls in love with a woman of higher social rank, saves her family from a bandit of robbers, and is promised the hand by her widowed mother, who then reneges on the deal. And so they consummate their love even so. And so it's kind of a scandalous thing in China, but a very popular work. So I remember there's one plate that's shown where the young man is climbing over the wall to meet with his beloved and her maid. The greatest piece that's here, and in my opinion, the best piece of its sort is that piece that I talked about having gone to England to pursue. It's unique as far as I know. It's not a form that's unknown. There were 17th century versions of it, I think, in the Vota cargo. There's an example that was retrieved from the 17th century. But we don't know its purpose, but the decoration is spectacular. It's of the very highest quality. The potting is unusual in that it's such a strange form, but everything about it is great. Although I don't know the narrative particularly, I think it's almost certainly from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms on the side, warriors with their horses. The particular scene, I don't know. It's an enormous literary work, and even if you know it thoroughly, sometimes the representations are not obvious. so you have to stretch a little bit. Really large. Everything about it is really great. Well, the most important things are dinnerware and tea wares, because you know the trade was really about tea. These millions and millions of pounds of tea. So that was the primary thing, but there were also decorative items made in less quantity. I would think it would have probably been more highly speculative to bring back a 24-inch vase and hope that you could sell it than to bring back a small tea service that perhaps anyone could own. You'd have to have a place for it in your home, and it would have to be to your taste. So there were items that were made for I think one of the things that's very interesting about this period is that we were really getting Western items. These were not Chinese forms, for the most part, being made by the Chinese to be brought back to the West. So the vases, there's a little more of a tendency where you'll see Chinese forms there. There are a couple of gu form vases above, upstairs, where they're flanking the Chinese robe, and that's an ancient Chinese form. But other vases were not necessarily so, although I think what we've shown here are largely Chinese. The vases, lidded vases in the vignette out front are certainly Chinese form. The vases of the Yang women warriors are Chinese forms with dragon handles. So these sort of decorative items were also used. Another Chinese form was the garden seat. There are some beautiful garden seats upstairs, which were probably never put in the gardens here. I'm not really sure. They were probably just to observe rather than set upon.
So in the Chinese culture, they were literally used as garden seats. Is that right?
In some of the depictions, if you look closely, you'll see people sitting on them out in the garden.
And there are two smaller, exquisite ones. Tell us about those two.
Those are particularly rare. I only know of 4 in existence. And they were separated, and they're not an exact pair. If you look closely, the scenes are exactly the same, but the coloration's a little different. But you can tell they were done in the same workshop and probably by the same hand or side by side, and were probably originally together. Some of these pieces have history that we know about recently, and one of those seats was actually owned and sold by Polly 25 years ago. And the other one was owned by another prominent antiques dealer in Boston who died, and actually Polly was asked to look at the collection, and she saw it, and she thought it was the same one, but it was not, as it turned out. She sent me a photograph, but they would not sell it. They put it through auction in Nantucket, and Polly told me about it, and I flew to Nantucket and brought that one home. And a few months later, because it brought a pretty robust price, the one that she had sold to a family in Maine came up for auction in Maine. So we drove through the snow to Fairfield, Maine in the middle of nowhere and bought that one and put it back together. But the child seat, I'm sure someone saw it as a novelty, probably for a little girl at home, something for her to, she probably sat on them.
So those two stools started out life together about 180 years ago or so, and now they're back together in your collection.
Together, I think it's important to notice the difference in these wares and the things that we think of generally as Rose Canton. There's a great difference in this and Rose Medallion. There is a difference in aging, and I think as we look at the history, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, once the Opium Wars began, trade broke down altogether, and so things started up again after the end of it. The kilns were literally destroyed in Jingdezhen, so there was no pottery being exported during that period, or if there was, it was the dribs and drabs left over and somehow secreted away. There was too much unrest. And then after that, the other ports were open, so not everything was coming out of Canton. So by the time you see Rose Medallion pieces, you're really into the 1860s and later. And there are a lot of those services that are, it's a very interesting period as well, it's just different. And a lot of those services were made for the American market. Ulysses Grant had a service, and a number of other prominent American statesmen had services that were done at that later time. But looking at the narratives, it becomes more formulaic as time goes on. I think this was sort of a shining moment before the first Opium Wars, and probably extended a little bit afterwards. Probably in that intervening period between the two wars, probably were some pieces and some enamelers that were remaining before they became, not extinct, but there was a great shift in the way this was perceived and the way it was produced. Well, I think it's going to be very interesting to see pieces highlighted and showcased individually. When I have it at home, it's often, pieces are more contextual. They're things that can be picked up and compared, and that certainly helps with collecting. I think when you encounter something for the first time in an exhibit, it's a little bewildering. It's hard to understand, so the longer you take to look at it, the more that you will appreciate what you're looking at. So on first glance, it all looks alike, but if you get up close to it and sort of try to unlock something, tell your own story about it, I think it's a much more interesting thing.
Well, we're deeply grateful to you for sharing your collection. I wish we could invite everybody to your house, you know, and they could see things the way you live with them and pick them up, but we can't do that at the museum. It's just not allowed. But this has been really enriching to our community, and I promise you it's going to have an impact on the children that we bring here and the classes and so forth. So thank you so much for your generosity. This is the second time now that we've borrowed from you another collection, the Recabolas, and there are collectors who are passionate, but they don't share, but you do share, and we appreciate that. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate your interest in it, and I hope that people will enjoy it.
They will, I guarantee you.